Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us today. My name is Ola Atamanova and I'm happy to see you here in Ukraine Media Center, Ukrinform. It's year 10 of the war and today is day 429 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And today we have invited you to talk about a very important topic. We will be talking about financial capabilities of the terrorist country and how can we seize those assets which were arrested or are about to be sanctioned. According to the evaluation of the World Bank, we need more than 400 billion United States dollars, and the main resource that this amount has to be compensated with should be the confiscation of the assets of Russian Federation and its residents to cover all the losses, all the damage inflicted in our country. But for the time being, we know that only 0.1% of that amount were confiscated. Only 0.1% of all the assets under sanctions were confiscated. So I want to introduce our guest today. It's Yaroslav Sidorovich, National Interest Advocacy Network ANTS founder and board member. Alexandra Hychiy, Ukrainian Canadian Congress National President. She will be joining us online. Good afternoon, Miss Alexandra. Also joining us, or about to join us, is Ihor Umanskyi, Minister of Finance of Ukraine in 2020. Also joining us will be Pavlo Sheremeta, Minister of Economic Development and Trade of Ukraine 2014. Mr. Pavlo will be joining us online as well. Bohdan Danylyshyn, the Minister of Economy of Ukraine, he will be joining us shortly, just like Yevhen, the National Anti-Corruption Agency leading expert on sanctions, and Sergei Kasenchuk, Director of the Ukrainian World Congress Mission of Ukraine representative, and Mr. Ihor Umanskyi, Minister of Finance of Ukraine. So, first of all, Mr. Yaroslav, what can we do to decrease the capabilities, the financial capabilities of the aggressor state, and how can we work in more intense manner to confiscate the arrested assets? Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, the sanctions are being discussed by a lot of people. A lot of sanctions were imposed since 2014. I prepared a presentation, and in yellow you can see the number of sanctioned individuals on whom the sanctions were imposed by Canada, Great Britain, United States, Ukraine, European Union, Switzerland, New Zealand, and Australia. Those are the key democratic countries who joined in imposition of sanctions. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February 22, the number of sanctions increased dramatically, and for the time being, more than 9,000 individuals were sanctioned in 2022. The same story is with the businesses, and it seems that such huge number of sanctions should work, but about a year ago the sanctions were something like, well, like sport fishing. When you catch a fish, you take a picture with it, you measure it, and you wait, and then you just let it go. So there was no law throughout the world which would allow to confiscate the sanctioned assets, and Ukraine was the first to adopt such laws. First resolution was on the 3rd of March, then on the 12th of May the new law was adopted on confiscation of assets. The law is working, In December, 17 billion were credited to the national budget, and Canada was the first of the democratic countries which adopted the special law on confiscation of assets under sanctions, and this experience will be shared with us directly from Canada, so we appreciate this leadership. And Chrystia Freeland, who is the leader of Ukrainians in Canada, she was able to present this law in G7 meeting as an example, and the first consultations are already going on. Well, you understand, democratic procedures are not just expropriation of money, it's law procedure, it's compliance with the law. So this is why it's being done gradually according to the adopted laws. But the biggest assets are not businesses and individuals. Those are the assets of the Central Bank of Russian Federation. And you know, the health sanctions, the 643 billion reserves of the Central Bank is the record amount which was documented in the February last year, is the amount of the reserves of the Russian Central Bank. After the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when the sanctions started being imposed, about $300 billion ended up under sanctions. However, a week ago there was an article in Safe Haven, in Economic Truth, Ekonomiczna Pravda. There was an attempt to raise our voice about these assets, to make sure that confiscation of these assets is being done by the Western partners, because those monies are in different accounts in Western countries. There is a number of assets which are not under sanctions, for example, accounts in gold or in Chinese yuan. But the essence is that it's difficult, but it should be done. Why it's complicated? Because there is immunity on diplomatic assets, and the question is whether this immunity is fair, whether it's fair to keep this immunity effective. Meanwhile, people are dying. So the sanctions were imposed by the Western countries to deter the aggression and to return the status quo before the beginning of those violations. But we cannot bring back this immense number of people who died, so there should be liability on part of Russia. I wanted to demonstrate you the dynamic of the central bank reserves. They fell 15% last year, but the central bank was issuing that funds from the reserves to maintain the rate of the Russian ruble, which fell from 37 rubles per dollar, and they stabilized the rate, and you see the assets are growing now again. Where is this growth coming from? They sold less oil and gas, but they sold it at higher price, and they continue selling those oil products. The 11th package, we were hoping that for example, Titan, Uranus and diamonds will be under sanctions too, but there are still assets which allow Russia to accumulate money. And you remember on the first slide, it was our dream to take away those 300 billion, and you see how it would decrease the reserves of the central bank. And to make the dream come true, we have to work jointly and to stimulate the governments of the countries to think about it, to work to make sure that liability is inevitable, economic liability. It's yet another front. So definitely the assets should be blocked, they should be confiscated, and they should be repatriated, they should be transferred to the accounts of Ukraine for reconstruction. Really, we need more than 400 billion according to the evaluation of the World Bank. So those propositions, like let's give this money, let's give 2.6% to Ukraine, so it will require 52 years to compensate all of it. That's not the scenario that we're looking at. Hello, Miss Alexandra, are you with us? Canada really became the first country which made legal appropriation of Russian assets and Russian individuals. So please share this experience with us. How did you make it? What is done in that front? Thank you very much. First of all, I want to extend my condolences to the families of those who suffered from Russian bombardments, and I want to thank all the Ukrainians who so bravely fight not only for their independence but for the freedom of the entire world. Thank you for this invitation to join you today. As it was said, I am a president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, who represents the Ukrainian Canadians in front of the Canadian government, and I want to convince you that we are in touch with the ministers of Canadian government on a daily basis, and we lobby the Ukrainian issue in front of them. Today, just like never, Ukrainians in Canada appreciate the support that Canada demonstrates to Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, since the February 2022, and as it was said, we were lucky that Ukrainian Chrystia Freeland is in the office of Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Canada, and thanks to the government of Chrystia Freeland, Canada became the first country, the first of the Western countries who on a legislative level adopted this support to Ukraine by appropriation of Russian assets. And Chrystia Freeland in this moment is meeting her colleagues from European Union in Stockholm to discuss this topic. Canada may be maybe not the most attractive country for Russian money. The most of their assets are in other countries. However, what's important is that Canada paved the way for other countries by its example. As Prime Minister Danylyshyn mentioned when he was visiting Canada recently, the funds for reconstruction of Ukraine after the war is over should not be paid by the taxpayers neither in Canada or any other country, and those funds, as it was said, they are the colossal amount of money, and those amounts will grow as the territories will be deoccupied. So it's in the best interest of the European Union, G7 and other countries to adopt logic legislation to make sure that the aggressors, the war criminals, pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. I will switch to English to describe the mechanisms which are envisaged by the law of Canada.
28th, 2022, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister Chrystia Freeland tabled the Budget Implementation Act. This act amended 3 pieces of legislation which deal with Canada's authority to impose sanctions.
Пане Олександре, у нас синхронний переклад, ви можете не зупинятися.
Together, these amendments created the necessary mechanisms to seize these are the Special Economic Measures Act, and the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act. This is the so-called Magnitsky Act. In 2023, Canada introduced additional changes to strengthen the regime. These amendments will clarify the definitions of ownership, to include subsidiaries and affiliated companies of sanctioned entities. So Canada will be able to very precisely seize and forfeit subsidiaries of sanctioned entities, and those who have beneficial ownership of these entities. Now, what types of property can be frozen? So this is real property or personal property, movable or immovable, tangible and intangible assets, and obviously this is money, funds, currency, digital assets, and virtual currency. So there are two processes which can be used. So the governor in council, or what we would call the cabinet of ministers, can issue an order that seizes and restrains property in Canada. That is controlled directly or indirectly by a foreign state or any person in that foreign state, or a national of that foreign state who does not ordinarily reside in Canada. And of course, Canada observes due process of law. And so the subject of an order may apply to the minister to request that this property be exempted. And of course, there should be proper notice to any person who may have an interest or right in that property. Yeah. In addition, the Minister of Foreign Affairs may apply to a court to request an order that this property be forfeited to the government. And of course, the same due process considerations apply in this case. And of course, this property could then be used for the reconstruction of a foreign state, the restoration of international peace and security, and for the compensation of victims. As has been mentioned, much work remains to be done to understand how state sovereign immunity can be dealt with in this context. Добре, у грудні
Well, in December 2022, the government of Canada announced that they will use this new legislation against Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. Canada has an intention to confiscate $26 million United States dollars or 36 million Canadian dollars from Granite Capital Holdings Limited, is the company that belongs to Roman Abramovich. Roman Abramovich is also a partial owner of Evras, which is the multinational manufacturer of steel with a big factory in Saskatchewan and Alberta provinces. There is the court order being prepared, and it's necessary to find out whether and to what extent Abramovich is about to protect himself against this court order. And before this law is being tried in the court, there is still a lot of questions without answers. If you invite me again in half a year, I will be probably able to tell you how the story ends. Thank you very much for this opportunity to have this address in front of you. Thank you very much, Miss Alexandra. Thank you for your address, for your speech. Mr. Ihor, very interesting is your expert thought. What's going on in the world? Is it really that democratic countries, our partners, are looking for a way to fulfill this confiscation, to impose sanctions, to confiscate those assets further on, and to what extent Ukraine implements this mechanism in a transparent manner. Good afternoon. I apologize for being a little bit late. Every time I'm trying to move around Kiev looking at those traffic jams, I'm asking myself, where are all those people going? Why aren't they at work? Well, I planned my speech in a little bit different way, but I'll try to answer your question. A little bit more than a year I was concerned with the military questions rather than with economic ones. And a couple of conclusions that I would like to share with you now are, first of all, when back in 2014 Russia seized Crimea, Luhansk and Donetsk, it was clear that full-scale war cannot be avoided. I don't remember who said that, but it doesn't change the substance of it. If the war is inevitable, postponing its beginning is only letting the enemy to accumulate strength and to get themselves prepared to the war. Well, whether Putin's regime was prepared to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, yes, they were. It was clear from the presentation that Mr. Yaroslav presented us, and there was a good article in Ukrainian Truth, Ukrainska Pravda. They were really preparing both militarily and financially. The level of reserves, it fell, but Russia was in top 4 countries by the amount of currency reserves. What we have in the summary of 2022, really, after imposition of sanctions, Russian system had to readjust its operation, and there was fall of reserves. But according to the results of the year, the profit again, I emphasize it, of the payment balance increased twice. The debt decreased 100 billion, the level of unemployment decreased, inflation a little bit more than 10%, the rate of ruble strengthened. Russia was preparing for imposition of sanctions too. They were not afraid of sanctions, and moreover, we have to understand this logic. I mean, logic of the people who make decisions. After sanctions were imposed, Putin personally, has he become poorer? Well, the rest doesn't concern him. So this is the goal that they were about to reach. Was Ukraine preparing for the full-scale invasion? Well, this is the main question. Well, and we will ask this question when time comes, but it looks like we didn't. Neither on military front, nor in information, nor in financial front. Our government officials were trying to convince us that we don't have to get prepared for the war, we have to cut military expenses and to finance the big construction and so on. For analysts, just look at not at the planned figures, but the actual figures of funding of state defense orders, the figures in the defense orders, and compared with the expenditures for the great construction, and make your conclusions. So first of all, we have to make conclusions. What was the condition of Ukraine at the beginning of the full-scale invasion? The only thing that Putin did not take into account is absence of desire of average Ukrainians, both civilians and military, to concede their territory. Next, we have to realize that as long as Russia exists in this way, in this legal status, as it exists, no matter who is their leader, and no matter when this full-scale invasion will end, territorial claims to Ukraine will never disappear, and we have to permanently await for repeated invasion and repeated both full-scale and narrowly targeted military operations by Russia, and we have to get prepared to them. How do we prepare to them? Urging Western countries to help us, to make us a part of NATO, will not provide the full security against such invasion. Only strong Ukraine with powerful defense complex and capable armed forces is something that can deter the aggressive intentions of any neighbor who may try to capture our territory. As to the sanctions themselves, we have to understand that sanctions are first of all a political resolution and the expression of political will of certain countries in relation to the aggressor country in this specific case. And the public Wests, let's call it so, without listing all the countries, they've made this political resolution, and the package of sanctions that are currently imposed on Russia is the most powerful and more powerful than anything that was imposed on any other country in terms of sanctions. But again, Russia was preparing for them, and this is the political measures which are being deterred by a lot of things like economic interests of the businesses in every such Western country. Much of them don't want to lose 160 billion consumer market in the aggressor country. It's painful for them. Their business is right here and right now, and the war is going on somewhere in Ukraine. And not all of them want to decrease their income. We have to realize it, whether we like it or not. Most important, we have to answer why are sanctions being imposed in general. Our expectation is that they are aimed at weakening the aggressor country against these aggressive actions. We have to understand that Russia has at least 4 sources to finance their armed aggression: their state budget, the funds of the central bank, the funds of the banking system, and relevant state and non-state funds, so-called pocket boxes for all needs, and the money of the immense state sector that may and are used for financing of the needs of the central government of Kremlin. So we have to fight them in all 4 directions. Another important area is the growth of Ukrainian military capabilities for resistance on one hand, and on the other hand is the restriction of capabilities of Russia to manufacture high-tech weapons. So in this case, the trade sanctions were very useful for Ukraine, but are they possible, and whether they will be effective without engagement of China, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other so-called safe havens, through which not only in Russia the points of the entry points and exit points for procurement of military equipment are possible, and I forgot to include media. A lot of backups are made through Indian companies, if it's news for somebody. So it's about supply of weapons. Without weapons, deterring Putin, well, conditional Putin, again, it doesn't matter. If Putin disappears tomorrow, the war in Ukraine would not end. We don't have to think that it's only one person who wants to wage war. So it's the supply, it's about the supply of weapons to Ukrainian army, and it's not about supply of F-16s. We're not ready to use them. We don't have trained pilots. The main thing, and it's the biggest problem of Ukrainian army, we don't have prepared trained officers of the general staff who could use such weapon. But the missiles, shells, cannons, howitzers, the resource that is available to Ukraine now, I'm telling you from the first person, it was worked out. Frequently the cannons used by our artillery is so the grooves in the barrels of our cannons, they are smooth now. Their resource is exhausted. We don't need 20 howitzers. This amount does not create any quality and quantity reinforcement of Ukraine to have advantage over Russian Federation. So this is what we expect from the West, but what holds them back from supplying those weapons in some limited qualities? We have to understand the logic behind the decision making. No matter how fast we want this decision to be taken, but after it's taken, the cooperation becomes real powerful. So for a long time the Western world were under impression that an impression of this myth: the second biggest strongest army of the world, don't scare the Russian bears, don't make it worse. But can it really become worse for Ukrainians? So another thing that deters the aggression is Ukrainians, our attitude to a lot of things. Many people in Ukraine and around Ukraine were fond of the process, not the result, but the process of processing funds for military needs. Now we are hearing accusations in this area, and I think that after the war is over, we will hear a lot of interesting information, because many people hold themselves back now, not only in the media but also in court processes. The Western countries, they hold this process back. They are not ready, whether at the expense of the taxpayer money or at the expense of other sources. They are not ready to take part in the operations with the corruption component. It's not being said directly, but diplomatically, in diplomatic terms, it's being said almost directly. And the same problem that will be after the war, because the reconstruction of the military and defense complex and the defense capabilities of the Ukrainian army is not something that Ukraine can do by itself without Western support, but the support not by giving somebody an opportunity to enrich on that. I know that the economic experts and financial experts will have their speeches after me. They will tell you how the sanctions should be strengthened, but we have to understand something in the context of seizure of assets. The full-scale war in Ukraine will not change one simple thing. West, which is used to be a center of investment flows, will not accept finding a way around sovereignty of any country, because it's the risk to lose such investment centers as London and New York in terms of their investment attractability. So those investment flows will start going through China, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on. So this is not something that the conditional West would accept. But having experience of return and confiscation of the former Yanukovych regime assets, I'll tell you what did not let us return those assets back then. Unlike United States or Great Britain, Ukraine doesn't have this English or continental law, fundamental to which was Roman law. So in Ukraine there was no legislative procedures for money hunters. We were not able to engage powerful companies with extensive experience of money hunters to return those assets to Ukraine, because there was no relevant legislation in Ukraine, and we cannot create it Well, however, there's nothing complicated. Some attempts to adopt those draft laws were not successful, and I'm convinced that further on, when sooner or later because any war sometimes is over, so the search for assets and attempts to change their ownership from aggressor country and its representatives to the country which was a victim of that aggression, without money hunters, it will be extremely experienced. So my proposal was to offer our people's deputies, our government, to adopt relevant legislation. And again, I'm repeating myself, both for Ukraine and for the civilized world, it's important to understand the simple thing. The best sanctions against Russian Federation is the weapons for Ukrainian armed forces. Thank you, Mr. Ihor. Mr. Yevhen, I would like to invite you to get involved in our conversation. We understand that the anti-corruption agencies, since the beginning of the full-scale aggression, got involved in search of assets and to imposition of sanctions. To what extent was this work? Does this work move forward? And again, what Mr. Ihor just told us, that the condition of Russian economy is at quite normal level, regardless all that work that was done not only by Ukraine but other countries as well. So in your opinion, do the sanctions work or we need more time? Good afternoon, everybody. Anti-corruption agency started exercising quite unnatural functions. The main work was suspended. You know that the inspections were suspended, the inspection of declarations. It was done to make sure that the risks are removed for the representatives of Russian Federation. They could see the information in state register, for example, in the declarations of the government officials. So we had a resource of analysts and we started creating the sanction lists. Just in short, in figures, we have lists of more than 24,000 candidates for whom the sanctions are proposed as of the beginning of April. For what I remember, or maybe the end of March, more than 13,000 entities ended up under sanctions. That work was not moving quite fast because the sanction track that existed in the pre-war period and the one that pace that it took during military period, well, we have to move 100 times faster. So probably starting from September, when we started getting remarks from our foreign partners that they imposed more sanctions than the country which is in war. So one first package was the synchronizing package in October, more than 2,000 entities. And now we are at 13,000 entities, even more. So that's the first area of our work, very important. When the identification of those entities is going on, we also created the portal Warning Sanctions. It enjoys quite a high level of visits. For example, there are such portals as Open Sanction in the world. It was the main portal when the entities could check their companies, whether they can work with other companies. Willfinity, WillCheck and others. But now we're trying to cooperate with those companies. For example, they'll check definitive when private businesses, global businesses, they address this database, international database, to check whether there is some red flags for some of their potential counterparts. There were no such relations before, and now we're trying to inform those portals, our partners, and they add that information to their databases so that it's further used by the global businesses in their operations with other companies to make sure that they can work with this or that company. Another track we're working on, for as of May 2022, in the world there were no examples of legislation when sovereign assets can be confiscated due to the armed aggression by any other country. So Anti-Corruption Agency was the first to get engaged in development of such legislation and to amend the Ukrainian legislation on sanctions. We contemplated the procedure of the confiscation of those assets by court. Now we are in cooperation with the Ministry of Justice, and we worked through more than 800 applications as to the search of the assets of the Russian companies or Russian individuals. When we get such application, we look for their assets in Ukraine, and afterwards the information, the packages of documents are being sent to Ministry of Justice, and they enforce those assets. For example, the assets of Deripaska, the family of Rothenbergs. There was a complicated case of VS Energy. They don't address Ministry of Justice so far, but it's Ihor, Babakov and Voyevodin, if I remember it right. So what's the use when we talk about this track? First of all, we work on this legislation. We practically work on it, and we tell our foreign partners, look, it works, let's create the similar standards which would allow you to confiscate the sovereign assets of Russian Federation. Yet another separate track is our attempts to check how they try to find ways around sanctions, and all those things are interrelated. We can say that Russia is a huge economy, it's a big economy. Well, it's smaller than obviously American or Chinese, I mean the United States of America, but it's very deeply integrated into the global economy, and they cannot cut it off. It's impossible. In their history, it never happened so that such a big economy is cut off the global economy. And we understand they are the largest country in the world by area, and we see that they try to find way around sanctions through certain safe havens, certain jurisdictions like Turkey, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Georgia, United Arab Emirates, to the lesser extent Saudi Arabia. They have significant economic relations with India and China. However, India is more cautious than China. So based on that, those jurisdictions which help them find a way around the imposed sanctions are the safe havens where the assets flow, and obviously they are different offshore jurisdictions like Cyprus used to be, British Virgin Islands, Panama, and so on. So why are we talking about this? it's a very meticulous work. It may not look interesting from outside, but turning over thousands of databases, we find connections between Ukrainian assets and those mastodons of the political regime in Russia, their connections with some offshore companies in Cyprus, which are being owned by their political top level political officials and oligarchs all around the world. So we have the relevant information on our radars. It's documented, and obviously they have so many elements of this kleptocratic and oligarchic structure that there is a lot of work to be done. Thank you, Mr. Yevgen. Mr. Pavlo, I would like to invite you to join our conversation. We would like to hear your expert opinion on whether the sanctions really influence the economy of aggressor country, and what should we do as Ukraine and our international partners to expedite the process of confiscation. Thank you. For what I understand, I'm being heard very well. I apologize, I was not able to visit you. I had to visit the Columbia City Council. I'm out of the meeting which is going on, just to tell you a couple of words. When I see that someone says about this better, I was hearing to the previous speaker on this panel discussion, which is really profound. He was giving you quite a comprehensive answer to your question. What I would like to recommend you, well, to all of us, is a book by Anders Osland and Anders Kubilius is the former Lithuanian, if I'm not mistaken, the minister, and now he's a European parliamentary reconstruction before and EU accession for Europe. And the section 4 there, they speak in detail. They say Russia must pay reparations. So it's about 10 to 12 pages where they provide quite an extensive analysis, practical analysis on what can be done. So that was an answer to a question, just to summarize what they're saying. And the details, I think this publication is not the only one, obviously, but I like this one better than others. So there is no doubt that Russia should pay, but it's easier to make it from those frozen sovereign assets that are frozen with the central banks. Both authors they refuse the statement that there are other factors that may slow down the world. Some concerns about dollar or euro, we have to be concerned more with the barbarity that we're suffering. So it's a bigger risk than the risk to dollar or euro. They remind us, so they say directly who it is. The two colleagues, Gary Hufbauer and Jeffrey Schott from Peterson Institute of National Economics, who say directly about 3 legislative acts in the United States. I will say in the Act of dated 1917, International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1717, and U.S. Patriot Act of 2001. All those laws, they provide in sufficient authorities to the United States government to confiscate the assets from the countries that commit those atrocities and barbarities which we're going through. I think it will be easier to answer the questions, if there are any, after this press conference. So there is a powerful piece that European Union should adopt the necessary legislation on state sponsorship of terrorism, because I understand it exists in the United States, but it does not exist in the European Union. But the United States should exercise those laws, and they should call Russia, recognize them as the terrorist state. We know that there are nuances, but again, what we're going through, there are no nuances. It's just a barbarity. It's more than terrorism. And again, I continue to quote the legislation which would allow removing international immunity from Russian sovereign assets, and that would enable to confiscate Russian sovereign frozen Russian sovereign assets, and such designation would allow appoint an international tribunal for crime of aggression. So I just quoted their last block. It's the section 4 of this book under Sosland and Alukabudius. Again, they reference other experts in this regard. They reference other legislative acts that allow doing that. So I think that there is legislative base, there are necessary arguments, there is the paved way what to do, there is a roadmap, so we only need to do it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pavlo. Mr. Vitaly, please get involved in our conversation and voice your thoughts. Vitaly Melnichuk, I'm the first deputy, and it was my honor to be in the parliament who declared the national sovereignty, and my further work in government and other institutions, it evidences that the resolutions that would be perceived by others, by other countries, other institutions, and they are related to us, they should be prepared by us. This is how they will be powerful, and in this regard I see there is a number of areas which we see now in Ukraine. These assets they end up under sanctions, then they're being arrested, and the amendments to the legislation on sanctions allow us to allocate them as we deem relevant through the court resolutions to reconstruct the economy and infrastructure of Ukraine. And the same thing is in Canada. It's the arrest, confiscation, and transition to Ukraine. Another third area is through international organizations. It's more complicated because it should be resolved on the global level through United Nations Security Council, recognition of Russia as the aggressor and their liability for their crimes that they should pay through reparations. But Russia is on the United Nations Security Council, moreover they are governing, but we have the resolution of the General Assembly as of November 14, 2022 about bringing Russia to liability for aggression and enforcement of reparations, and there is a relevant list of countries who were voting for this resolution, and there were proposals to create collective international agreement to be signed by those countries, so we have some joint action in this regard. The lawyers may say more about this, to what extent is it possible and what other steps are necessary to make it happen. But there is another matter, a matter of reformation of United Nations Security Council. There were certain attempts to remove Russian Federation from the Security Council, and the resolution that may be adopted, it resolves all those issues on a global level. So those are the three main areas, important areas, but taking into account the fact that obviously everybody helps us, that resolution by the government of Canada, which has a lot of similarities with what was done here in Ukraine, but again, all those efforts should originate from us, and in this regard we have to have some government team created which would include the representatives of anti-corruption agency, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Finance, scientists, representatives of other research communities, to work on the proposals and maybe even draft legislation which can be given to our partners, to other countries, because it's only us who can propose all of it, and we should initiate those conversations with our partners, not on the general topics but about some specific things, and then through advocacy to seek such resolutions. It's a great work, and this work should be done by us. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them, and then we get back to our...
Yeah, Chris Abeson, National Security Media. Since Russia did plan ahead to hide their assets around the world, were there areas that they did so that are going to be obviously more difficult to reach, or do you see ways in which they were hiding their money around the world that those of us who are covering it might want to take a look at that globe and see, how they planned that, if you don't mind?
Who will be answering this question, please? Well, the right statements were already made here, that they started preparing from 2014, but I think they had that concept way before that. But what we've seen searching for their assets in Ukraine, and when we see other offshore companies in our radars through which they were controlling Ukrainian assets, what we see is that before year 2010, such entities as Ihor, Babakov, Deripaska, Rotenbergs, they were not hiding. Everything was transparent, trackable, and all those moments with entangling and transition of assets, they started happening only starting from 2014, when there were first targeted sanctions imposed, but they've understood that it was a signal, and they need to hide their assets, and they did a great job for the last 8 years. Ukrinform, what is your evaluation of the speed how the Ukraine gets rid of this cooperation with Russian Federation? We see that only now those many agreements are being cancelled that were operating in certain economic areas, and as of the end of the last year in Ukraine, it was possible to register the business to this or that extent connected with Russia, whether through beneficiaries, subsidiaries. So there is a statistics that a little bit more than 10 such legal entities were established. Well, it seems not such a big number, but has anything changed since then? Thank you. when we started doing it, it's not only anti-corruption agency who was receiving that information, but we are in cooperation with a lot of institutions, including the representatives of Ucontrol. We got information from them, we were analyzing it. So as of March, there were about 17,000 companies that are directly or indirectly controlled through legal entities or individual entities from Russia. Well, you understand what an immense amount it is. So the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine adopted the resolution to protect the national interests of Ukraine, which prohibited any registration and enforcement, re-registration of shares in the companies which are controlled by the citizens of Russian Federation, whether directly or indirectly. Unfortunately, there is a counteraction to any such action, and there are some single cases where the persons are getting passports of certain jurisdictions. Well, not everybody is Deripaska, you understand, but like some people are not being tracked to the full extent in the view of what of that number that I gave you, 17,000. Sometimes it happens so that some persons get the passports of other jurisdictions, and this is how they re-register the businesses. So in that situation, we have to bring up some specific examples, but yes, I know about such cases. Mr. Yaroslav, you wanted to add something. Well, not all the international agreements are yet cancelled which are related to Russia. In April 2018, the government adopted the resolution to amend or to bring up the agreement on protection of investments, to terminate the agreement on protection of investments, because there is an immunity on the reserves of central bank, but there is also immunity on investments which can be protected in Stockholm, in London, in the United Nations courts. And there are certain risks related to it during the confiscation of Russian assets, even here in Ukraine, if they were registered as investments. So terminating this agreement, adopting new resolutions on sanctions will lift that immunity. And another thing is tracking of final beneficiaries. It was not easy for Ukraine to adopt the law in 2015, to adopt the law on banks' liability for lending to affiliated persons. You can count the banks like by the fingers of your hand, but there are certain sanctions contemplated by that law. So beneficiaries can change. This is why this story is complicated, and it's a detective story. And my opinion is that the search of those assets should have a lot of people involved, many young people involved. If you know the foreign language, you can search for the assets abroad. You cannot find Usmanov in German registers, but for example, you can find it in the island of Maine. He is an owner of the company, and that company is the owner of the real estate in Germany. So what we're talking about here is to untangling this chain from the final beneficiary to that to that assets which should end up under sanctions, under arrest eventually. Mr. Sergey, I would like to invite you to have a couple of words. Thank you for the invitation. I'm not an expert on sanctions or confiscation, but I represent the whole Ukrainian Congress, and when we talk about sanctions, we talk about parliaments, we talk about governments who are supposed to make decisions, we talk about international organizations, and as it was mentioned correctly here, it's important to have the political will here, and is the key thing here. We cannot get ourselves limited to an expert crowd, we cannot get ourselves limited to the actions of the government. But now that the war is going on for such a long time and the world is tired, and it's not so comfortable for them to remain concerned with such issues. It's important to have the process moving, and the role of Ukrainian communities all around the world is very important here. And I appreciate the input of Alexandra Hychiy from Canada, where there is a powerful influence and specific concrete resolutions, and we see that Canada is ahead, but not everything is so fine, because there is internal struggle everywhere, even in Canada. When Canadian government adopted the resolution to release the turbine for Siemens in infringement of this, in violation of the sanctions that they adopted, the Ukrainian Congress, they sued them to communicate that idea to Canadian government, to German government. It's not only important to adopt the law, but it's necessary to comply with it. So this is how we moved that process. The Congress of Ukrainians initiated the parliamentary hearings. The issue was resolved, but again, it was like a safety before the next step. We see Russia is pressing. They're trying to play with it, they're trying to fiddle with it, they're trying to find a way around. So we have to keep all the world in tonus to continue this work. The best sanctions, as it was said, is the support of the military. From the very first days we initiated our project Unite with Ukraine. We took the best generals, best experts throughout the world who support us with their advice. How is it better to support Ukraine? How is it better to raise the funds? The last tranche was 25 Spartans, which were transferred to Kharkiv recently. So there's a lot of work in different areas, and sanctions are not only tangible assets. We were working very efficiently through sport areas, so Russia doesn't work through with their propaganda through their athletes, not to let Russian and Belarusian athletes to take part in the Olympic Games when Russians try to deter the Western influence with their athletes. So the plan of actions too, the international working team, they included the matter of sport in their agenda too. What we were working with public organizations, it's all in work. And the latest intangible assets, millions of forced refugees, they left. We're talking about returning of money, but we also talking about returning of people. We ask those countries, please accept them, but what they do, they integrate them in their life, in their economy. And now that we have this money incoming, we have to inject them into economy. And those people who receive the Western knowledge, we work very actively to preserve their identity, their connection to Ukraine, so we can bring them back. And we believe when we reach victory, so we can bring those people back to rebuild our country. Thank you very much. Dear friends, unfortunately our time is running out, but I would like to end our conversation with giving a word to each of you. What should we do so that the government and non-government sectors, so that the experience of Canada spreads to other countries? What should we do to make it happen? Thank you very much for this discussion, for this opportunity, for the time. I will repeat myself. I appreciate the input of all of our partners, not only from Canada, United States, European Union, for all the support that they extend to us, including the work with sanctions. But we have to understand that during the war, the sanctions are not the instrument that may give a quick effect. Freezing of assets is the work that takes years. The freezing of assets, which is going on all around the world, will only provide a success to them after the court processes that may take years. So in this context, I would like to ask both Ukrainians and our Western partners not to leave that work even after the end of the full-scale war. This work has just started, and it will succeed not in 1 or 2 years. Thank you. If I may, first of all, really thank you for this discussion. We've talked a lot, but we have to say even more to tell the citizens of Canada and many countries that this victory is not forged by the bravery and the weapons of our armed forces. It's forged by in economic front, the second front too. Just like during World War II, it took a very long time to open the second front with Lend-Lease, and thus this second front, it became the resolving point, a point where the World War II ended. In the same way, the economic capability of Russia should be reduced with a joint effort. Within 14 months, it was not, we did not succeed adopting all of the sanctions that we wanted. But again, if we remember, 14 months ago, they were saying no weapons. We will give you 5,000 first aid kits. But again, we see how this rhetoric changed. Well, this article in Safe Haven, the ending words are never say never again. And no matter how impossible it seems now, I mean those immunities, but we have to create the new legislation to amend the new, because if democracy does not take over, it will be the Pandora's box. Thank you very much. I would like to continue this thought again. Apart from the military and economic areas, there is a lot of areas. It's information area. It's a key area because it's a hybrid war, and it started and it will continue. And there is cultural area. So Russia uses everything as a weapon: culture, language, history, economy. And what's important to us is to unite in all levels, to do our job in all levels. And what's necessary for us, what kept us alive, is that Russia wanted to eradicate our identity. This is what unites us throughout the world. This is the key thing, and I want to thank all the Ukrainians in every country, in the United States, in Canada, but every other country did their job. We unite 64 countries, and Ukrainians everywhere they work, and our unity is our strength. Is if everybody does everything that they can, we will come to our joint victory. Miss Alexandra, if you have anything to add, I share the idea that was expressed earlier, that the best sanctions is weapons for Ukraine, and then we may proceed to the reconstruction. But first we have to win. Thank you for your support and for being with us. Right to life and right of ownership are inherent human rights. But no matter who says what, right to life is primary. And today in Ukraine, Russia uses the capabilities of Western democracy to direct their right of ownership against our right to life. And it's a serious factor that we should demonstrate when we talk with the international organizations or other countries, and in general having our proposals, and they are already there in Ukraine, in Canada, they look sort of alike. And when our president goes to another country, I think that, or the presidents of other countries, or the heads of the governments, or the ministers of foreign affairs, when they come to Ukraine, we have to talk to them about signing some documents, memoranda for about forfeiture of assets. That should be a meticulous work. If we don't do it today, nothing happens. We have to do it on a daily basis on this working level. Thank you. Dear all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to express myself on this subject. What I want to say is that Ukraine is becoming a subject. I remember the beginning of 2000s when there was a scandal with Kolchugas, and during some international event we had to pick the seats for the representatives of different countries, and in order not to put President Kuchma by the side of the representative of the United States, we had to switch the alphabet to the French, but we were never able to forecast such a tragedy. But neither we were able to forecast that Ukraine would become a subject. So again, it's a meticulous technical work, but it's systemic, and believe me, we are in constant dialogue with the representatives of embassies, of our partners, the partners in our sanction coalition, and those applications that we get, we keep working even during weekends. I'm not exaggerating. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for this conversation. I want to thank our armed forces for this opportunity to hold events like this. I want to say thank you to everybody, and I want to emphasize that we work all together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.